Lord of the Mysteries audiobook by Kevin 1001 First Movement T. When the wraith in front of him was gone, Emlyn White retracted his gaze, untied the thread on the dossier, and pulled out the documents inside. As he read through them, Emlyn had a rough idea of Ernst Boyar's routine. This sanguine viscount had a routine which was rather random, staying at home, out visiting exhibitions, partaking in wine tasting at manors in the city outskirts, shopping at department stores with female companions, or sketching female models. He was like the typical wealthy man. However, Ernst had recently been visiting St. George Borough every other day to monitor the renovations of the furniture factory he had invested in. It was a bid to ensure that it could quickly resume work. This way, the sanguine viscount's lifestyle became repetitive. The places he visited, the paths he took, and the places he had lunch were repeated every other day. Emlyn pressed down on his temples, seriously filtering out 3 venues which were suitable for the operation. The first was inside or at the entrance of the furniture factory owned by Ernst Boyar. The second was St. Ireland Square, where he stopped along the way home for a meal and to feed birds. The third place was Backland Bridge. Unless Ernst was willing to take a huge detour, he had to pass by this area when traveling between his home and St. George Borough. These 3 spots meet the requirement of having plenty of people, making it chaotic. However, Backland Bridge has too few entrances and exits. With the 2 ends locked down, one can only leave by jumping into the river, an act only chosen by idiots. St. Ireland Square comes under St. Ireland Cathedral, core to the Church of Steam in Backland, and even the entirety of Lone. It's akin to the Second Holy See. It meets Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion. It can effectively prevent conflicts from escalating, and it can interfere with any subsequent divination and investigations. Emlyn gradually had an inclination. And once a living being had an inclination, they would unknowingly seek more reasons to affirm their choice, and Emlyn was no exception, without a doubt. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that St. Ireland Square met almost all the requirements. First, Ernst wouldn't stay in the area for too long. He would have lunch at a restaurant with civilized cuisine since he was born in Civilhouse County. Secondly, there were several tracked carriage stops in the vicinity, making the area filled with traffic on foot. With most of them being people from the lower or middle class, accidents often happened. Thirdly, with it as the origin, one would enter the area south of the bridge if one didn't head to the Backland Bridge. It would then be close by to the Harvest Church. Finally, at noon, the St. Hyrule section ND Cathedral would spew steam, turn its levers, and chime a clock. It was inevitable for everyone's attention to be attracted. It's confirmed. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. Raising his right hand and adjusting his bow tie, his red eyes were filled with anticipation. At this moment, he suddenly frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. St. Ireland Square was just perfect for the job. It was so suitable that almost all the conditions were met. Will Ernst be wary against my revenge? Why would he allow himself to stay in such an environment for such long periods of time? Even if he's stupid enough to not realize it, wouldn't the Earls warn him? The corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up slightly as he understood the reason. St. Ireland Square was the venue the sanguine upper echelons had designated for him. Heh! Emlyn chuckled, keeping his mouth curled. He decided to request Mr. Fool to have a gathering for the few members, and also invite Mr. Hanged Man to discuss the plan in detail. This was different from the framework that they had previously decided upon. They needed to consider every detail and consider every problem. At 15 minutes to 12, St. George Borough, St. Ireland Square, in a private room on the 3rd story of a restaurant northwest of the square. A figure stood in front of the window, holding a cup filled with scarlet blood-like liquid. He was leisurely looking at the fountain nearby and the crowds that came and went. He was a lanky person, wearing a formal suit meant for banquets. His light-colored hair that was nearly silver and his bright red eyes combined together to give him a sense of coquettish handsomeness. There was a constant faint smile lining his lips. "My lord, will it really be fine? Emlyn seems to be different from before." This can be seen from his recent hunt of the primordial moon believers. A middle-aged man in a dark suit walked to the window and said with some hint of worry. The man who had been politely addressed cast his gaze at the square where Emlyn White stood. He was listening to a violinist busking on the street as he chuckled. "Our preparations are enough even against a demigod, much less a kid who hasn't even become a viscount. Besides, we don't really plan on doing anything serious. Our only goal is to identify and make confirmations. This is a lot simpler than preventing certain people from escaping." As he spoke, the man with the light hair and bright red eyes raised his right hand slightly, rotating the ring on his left ring finger. The ring was made of silver, and embedded in it was a strange gem with a ghostly blue hue. On a carriage driving towards St. Ireland Square, Ernst Boyar had his right hand over his left. He naturally rotated the ring on his ring finger that had a ghostly blue gem embedded in it. He casually looked out the window and saw a trackless carriage slowly drive over from afar. A paperboy slightly taller than 160 centimeters had a sling bag across his chest as he peddled his papers along the street. Quite a number of bicycles had replaced the carriages that were often seen last year. They darted through the crowds in St. George Borough. Here, the number of workers wearing light blue or grayish-blue uniforms with hats had far exceeded the number of people in formal suits and top hats. Ernst retracted his gaze as he chuckled. He had no fear about what would happen next. He even looked forward to it. He believed that he had made enough preparations. He wore Oath of Rose on his left hand. It allowed him to share what he saw, heard, and smelled with Earl Mistral from a distance away. It made sure that nothing would go wrong while ensuring that their objective was met. In his inner pocket where his silver pocket watch was, there was a moon paper figurine. These could suffer a single lethal blow or an attack that targeted his soul body. It ensured that he wouldn't suffer any serious injuries or death within a short span of time. He also wore Alcohol Nemesis, a diamond brooch. It kept him brimming with energy with lucidity in his thoughts. It raised his resistance against spells that acted on the body of heart and mind. By his waist was a belt named Moonlight Sash. It could effectively reduce sun and lightning damage. These mystical items were the accumulation of Ernst's wealth or were bestowed by Earl Mistral. It made sure that Ernst was a target that could hardly be quickly finished off or controlled. With the sanguine Viscount's natural resistance against nightmare-type influences, Ernst was nearly without weakness. Even against a demigod, he could put up a fight as long as the latter didn't reveal their mythical creature form. The only problem is that the negative effects of all these mystical items are quite excessive. Ernst's facial muscles twitched, but he quickly composed himself. The Oath of Rose would make his thoughts appear in Earl Mistral's mind from time to time, and if he kept wearing it for a week without removing it, the pair who had the matching rings might very well end up in love, regardless of gender or race. Moon paper figurine was an expendable item. It had nearly zero side effects apart from making the body slightly cold. The Alcohol Nemesis brooch's problem was that it would deal continuous damage to one's liver and brain. If it was worn for excessively long periods of time, it might result in one losing one's thoughts and logical reasoning. Therefore, one had to take it off for 15 minutes after every half an hour of equipping it. Once Moonlight Sash was worn, it made all senses much sharper, making it easy for one to see and hear things one shouldn't see or hear. At the same time, the wearer would feel itchy at intermittent intervals. Let's hope they don't cower in fear, and that this doesn't drag on. Ernst Boyar checked on his condition once again, casting his gaze of anticipation at the St. Hieroland Square's entrance nearby. On the other end of St. Hieroland Square, Emlyn White, who was taking in the sights of the buskers on the streets, suddenly looked up at a bird that flew over. Following that, he raised his hand to press down on his top hat. Bowing his head slightly, he briskly walked to the middle of the square, approaching the fountain. In this process, Emlyn's figure kept moving as he mixed into the crowd. However, this failed to avoid Earl Mistral's tracking. This sanguine Earl with silver hair rotated the ghostly blue gem ring on his left ring finger and coldly said, "Take note." At the entrance of St. Hieroland Square, Ernst Boyar grew increasingly pumped. He knew that the operation was about to come finally. Emlyn still chose St. Hieroland Square after all. Ernst cast his gaze out the window once more, warily watching the pedestrians on the street, the trackless public carriages that were about to pass him, the ordinary paper boy who was peddling his papers, and the elegant windows of the surrounding houses and shops. He didn't believe that Emlyn's potential partners were hiding in there, because there were even more, better spots in St. Hieroland Square that made it conducive to take action. However, he still kept up the required level of wariness. Suddenly, his body lunged forward slightly as he nearly got out of his seat. The carriage he was on had stopped without any warning. Right on the heels of that, the horses that pulled the carriage seemed to be in a nightmare as they raised their front hooves, struggling wildly, flipping the carriage to the ground. During this process, Ernst Boyar actually had ample space, time, and strength to help the carriage driver control the berserk horse. However, he didn't do so because he saw a transparent wolf-shaped specter jump over from outside the window. It had thrown a rose within its body. A rose. Ernst Boyar's eyes widened as the carriage toppled. He hurriedly jumped to the side and out the carriage as he made an illusory and incorporeal black chain extend out of the void. It wrapped around the wolf-shaped specter. With a soft poof, the wolf-shaped specter dissipated without a struggle. And when Ernst Boyar found his footing, he stood there motionless, his eyes turbid. He had already been pulled into a deep sleep. In a trackless public carriage that passed him by, a black-haired, green-eyed young man wore a thin trench coat. His back was facing the middle of the street as he focused on reading a notebook with a green bronze hardcover. Around him, the other passengers were either reading the papers or chatting. Some were looking out only to see the berserk horse quickly recover. With a whoosh, the black-haired, green-eyed man flipped the page of the notebook. The trackless carriage continued forward and gradually distanced itself. 1002 movement T St. Hieroland Square, in the northwestern Cummer, at the third story of a restaurant. When the wolf specter with the rose appeared in front of Ernst Boyar, the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed minstrel retracted his gaze from Ernst Boyar. Darkness suffused from behind him as countless tiny bats flew within. Bribe. Just as this sanguine earl silently muttered this single word, he saw the toppled carriage, heard the neighing of the horse, and smelled all kinds of smells. However, he wasn't able to instantly find the origin of the disturbance and accident. At this moment, his vision darkened as his eyes seemed to lose the ability to take in light. The din in his ears also halted. Earl Mistral chortled inwardly as he immediately fused with the bats behind him, rematerializing beside Ernst Boyar. Suddenly, in his black vision, a point of light appeared. This point of light rapidly expanded as it grew brighter and brighter. A golden figure with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings walked out of it. The pairs of wings spread out, blanketing Mistral's vision, causing light and darkness to mix. This created mysterious and complicated symbols that didn't differentiate themselves within the golden figure. It was both holy and corrupted, both light and dark. Angel. Mistral's pupils widened slightly as he couldn't help but take a step back, terminating his previous thoughts. In confusion, Ernst Boyar rapidly snapped awake when he saw a pair of limpid eyes that resembled crystalline gems or a lake. He felt a copy of the newspapers being stuffed into his hand. In those emerald-green eyes were ripples. Deep within the emanating ripples were twirls of a vortex that seemed to suck in the soul of anyone who lay their eyes on them. Ernst Boyar instantly became engrossed in it as he couldn't move his eyes away. Then he heard a gentle and ethereal female voice in his ears. "Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White." This voice was layered as it resounded within Ernst Boyar's ears. It drilled into his brain, sinking deep into his heart. Ernst Boyar nodded in a daze, sensing that there was more, but he couldn't hear it clearly. The paperboy with a sling bag diagonally across his shoulders swiftly turned around and agilely passed through the bicycles, mixing into the crowd that came and went. This boy had a pretty face as his messy hair drooped down and hid his brows. As he walked, he took off a black fishnet glove that he had worn at some point in time, stuffing it into his sling bag filled with newspapers. As the wind blew, his clothes shrank as a spot on his exposed arm protruded out. A few seconds later, Ernst Boyar suddenly jumped back from where he stood, doing so as though he had been trying to dodge something. No good. I was influenced by a nightmare's ability. Just as he found his footing, his pupils dilated as he looked around his surroundings in a state of high alert, prepared for any impending attacks. Although Ernst Boyar was perplexed about how easily he was pulled into a dream, he knew that it wasn't time to consider the details. What followed next was key. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Ring. A few bicycles passed him as they used their bells to warn the gentleman in the middle of the road to make way. Ernst Boyar narrowed his eyes as he glared at him, his muscles under his clothes ready to deliver their might. These few bicycles circled around him as the pedestrians came and went, some slowing down their footsteps and pointing their fingers. Gong, gong, gong. 12 gongs were heard as the white steam spewed out from the chimneys of St. Hierolynd Cathedral. The holy hymns of praise resounded as the gears and levers got to work. On the square, everyone stopped in their footsteps. At that holy moment, they either closed their eyes in prayer or were listening silently, regardless of whether they were believers of the god of steam and machinery or not. Only the pigeons that were being fed flew up and soared into the sky. Gong, gong, gong. As the gongs sounded, no one moved. Even Earl Mistral, who was inside a private room at the restaurant, stood there motionless with a heavy expression. His vision had already recovered, but all he saw was workers wearing grayish-blue or light-blue clothes and bicycles of the same make. Apart from that, he discovered nothing. Furthermore, Ernst Boyar hadn't been injured at all. Of course, he had guessed that the paperboy was problematic from the newspaper in the sanguine Viscount's hand. However, he didn't attempt to carry out a pursuit. Clearly, the power that had borrowed the level of an angel didn't belong to a low or mid-sequence Beyonder. This also meant that Emlyn White's faction had at least a demigod hidden in the vicinity. Mistral believed that once he took action, he was bound to be stopped or even incur retaliation. In a situation of being easily detected while not knowing where his opponents were hiding, Mistral believed that it spelled trouble. Carrying out a pursuit in such cases only exacerbated the matter. Furthermore, to the Sanguine, this was only a test. If the faction backing Emlyn had mobilized a demigod, they could detain that powerhouse thanks to Ernst Boyar's protective measures. And through Oath of Rose, Mistral could confirm the attacker's identity. They had never thought of escalating the matter into an intense conflict. In their plans, it only involved Earl Mistral stopping the other party to prevent Ernst Boyar from suffering any harm. In the present situation, they had lost the initiative. To forcefully carry out a pursuit might highly likely result in a demigod's battle, and in Backland, around St. Hierolyne Cathedral, this was equivalent to suicide. Besides, to Mistral, since the other demigod hadn't personally taken action and had only provided auxiliary help, to personally take action and make a pursuit would be a loss of decorum and an insult to his reputation as a sanguine earl. Humph! I want to see what happens next. Mistral's facial muscles twitched as he rotated the ghostly blue ring on his left hand once more. After the 12 gongs, Emlyn started walking again. He circled past the fountain and arrived at the other end of St. Hierolyne Square amidst the landing pigeons. He then saw Ernst Boyar, who had his back hunched slightly, afraid to even move half a step. He saw the toppled carriage, the horse that was flicking its tail, and the carriage driver who wore a look of pain. Emlyn walked over, took out a wallet and pulled out £100. He handed it to the carriage driver and said, "This is your compensation." Ah, the carriage driver wore a blank but pleasantly surprised look. The rental carriage wasn't his. He was only an ordinary employee. After the carriage was damaged because of the horse being startled, he experienced a brief moment of feeling the pinch. Following that, it was anxiousness and despair that ruled over his mind. Based on the so-called contract and other similar accidents he had seen over the years, he was responsible for all of this. This meant compensation from him, and with his income and family situation, meant bankruptcy. During that short moment, all kinds of thoughts had surfaced in the carriage driver's mind. They were mainly of 3 types. One was to scare the frozen gentleman and get him to pay compensation. This prevented his family from falling apart, with his children having to slave away at the factories at a young age. Another option was to immediately bring the horse to a gangster and sell it. Then, he would return home and leave Backland with his wife and children. The last option was to arrange for his family to move from the place they rented. He would then plead with the owner of the carriage, hoping that he could repay it in installments. If the person wasn't agreeable, he would rather be thrown into jail than reimburse him a single penny. Now, having £100 suddenly hit him left his mind groggy. He was at a loss for words. £100 was enough to buy a brand new rental carriage and even more. Emlyn ignored the carriage driver and looked at Ernst. "Everything's fine now. Aren't you the biggest problem? How can it be fine with you here?" Ernst lampooned as he rotated the ring with the ghostly blue gem on his left hand. For some unknown reason, he felt that he should believe Emlyn White and even approach him. Emlyn shot a glance, suddenly turned around and walked briskly into an alley. Ernst subconsciously opened up his stride and followed closely behind. He kept holding onto the newspaper in hand. The 2 sanguine moved at extremely fast speeds, with one running and the other chasing. However, they didn't dare reveal anything extraordinary. When Earl Mistral sensed that the 2 sanguine were beyond the reach of his spirituality, he used the connection between the paired oath of rose rings to follow behind unhurriedly. Emlyn occasionally made detours, taking shortcuts and occasionally returning to spots they had been before. It made it difficult to guess where his destination was. As for Ernst, he was like a bull having seen a red cloth. He refused to give up as he followed closely behind. Unknowingly, the 2 sanguine arrived at Rose Street, which was south of the bridge. At this moment, Emlyn suddenly sped up. He wasn't afraid that others saw him producing afterimages as he dashed right into the Harvest Church. Ernst did the same. Not good. From afar, Earl Mistral was just about to descend upon them to stop the subsequent developments when Ernst's figure vanished inside the Harvest Church's entrance. Catcha! A tile at Mistral's foot instantly shattered. After entering the cathedral, Ernst came to a realization. He then saw a figure wearing a brown priest robe stand up at the front of all the rows of pews. He appeared like a mountain. At the same time, the entire cathedral turned heavy as if it was a jail. It seemed to fuse with the land itself. Ernst's mind buzzed immediately as another voice sounded in his mind. After you awaken from the first hypnosis, throw all the items on you to Emlyn White. Amidst shuffling sounds, Ernst took off his sash, threw out the brooch, and slammed the various items towards Emlyn White. This included his silver pocket watch and a wallet filled with cash. Pa! The newspaper in his hand fell to the ground, throwing out a paper card that was stuffed within. On the paper card was the goddess of justice sitting on a chair and holding a sword and scale. It was the tarot card Justice. 1003 Ritornello. After throwing everything other than his clothes, Ernst Boyar was stunned for a moment before he snapped to his senses. What am I doing? What did I do? This sanguine viscount finally recalled the matters he had deliberately forgotten, those pair of emerald green limpid eyes. A psychological cue, no hypnosis. Ernst Boyar looked around in anger and irresistible horror, instinctively taking in the situation he was in. His gaze then landed on the mountain-like figure. He saw Father Otravsky with his thin and sparse brows. Instantly, Ernst Boyar had all sorts of thoughts run through his mind and collide with one another. He quickly came up with one intense thought. He didn't put up any resistance, and he immediately said, "I'll come here to do a month of volunteer work." Emlyn's predicament had long been spread amongst the sanguine in Backlund. Ernst Boyar was well aware of Father Otravsky and knew that, even if he were to put up a fight, it was difficult for him to escape the fate of doing volunteer work. He might as well surrender and choose conditions that were more beneficial to him. At the very least, I shouldn't have any cues planted in my mind and end up converting my faith to Earth Mother. This thought flashed through Ernst's mind. He discovered a lantern in Otravsky's hand, and inside it was a strange candle that seemed to be covered in human skin with protruding lumps. Under the candlelight's faint illumination, Ernst's pupils widened again. He only had one thought on his mind remaining as it kept resonating, another psychological cue. At that moment, he felt the gloominess thicken in his heart. "All right," Otravsky nodded and agreed to Ernst Boyar's request. Emlyn held back his smugness and pleased smile. He then looked at the items he had caught, looking like a farmer who had just reaped a bountiful harvest. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square, the lights darkened as a huge shadow appeared. Tiny bats flew out of the darkness and quickly clumped together. Smoke rose up as the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Earl Mistral appeared at the spot where the bats had appeared. Everything around him had been restored to normal. His servant, a middle-aged man in a dark formal suit, immediately stepped forward and asked with a bow, "My lord, are you having your meal now?" He couldn't tell if things had happened smoothly, or if something had gone wrong, much less about the success of the outcome from the Earl's face. However, he didn't dare inquire. Mistral nodded and said, "Yes." He walked to the table with a composed look, took off the ring with the ghostly blue gem, and sat down without showing a chink in his disposition. It was as though he had headed out to feed the pigeons. This rich smell is rather unique, but it's not bad. In the private room neighboring Earl Mistral, Klein was wearing a very ordinary face as he commented on the Civilhouse cuisine delicacy lamb tripe. This punishment operation was an attempt by the few members of the Tarot Club, one that didn't need the world or Mr. Fool's interference. But considering how Miss Justice and the Moon Emlyn had zero experience in such matters and lacked experience in other matters, he had come to the area incognito as a final safeguard. He had previously used his marionette to prey to the Fool, while he entered the attached bathroom of his private room to head above the gray fog. Using the corresponding point of light, he had taken in the entire square and its surroundings. He kept holding the sea god scepter the entire time, prepared to deliver a lightning strike to prevent any problems once he discovered anything amiss. However, he ultimately didn't do a thing. Everything happened more smoothly than he imagined. There was no need for him to consider the experience the star Leonard, but Miss Justice, who was participating in such matters for the first time, had exceeded his expectations. She wasn't nervous at all, not showing any signs of panic. Indeed, a sequence 6 of the spectator pathway is far greater than low and mid-sequence beyonders of the other pathways when it comes to controlling emotions. Even if she felt uneasy, she would have resolved it with her beyonder powers before the operation. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he continued sampling the other delicacies. Outside the window on St. Ireland Square, it became filled with lively music, an eclectic mix of the flute, violin, accordion, and seven-string guitar. A rental carriage was slowly circling around the perimeter of St. Ireland Square. Leonard Mitchell, who was prepared to return to the north bank of the Backland Bridge, took one look at the pigeons in the middle of the square before asking with a suppressed voice, "Old man, what's your take regarding the outcome of this operation?" After he pulled Ernst Boyar into a dream, he flipped Leymano's travels and activated Angel's embrace. He then left the scene on carriage, unsure of the subsequent developments. In his mind, Pallas Zaros snapped back. In the fourth epoch, there's such a saying, believe in the might of deities. This means that this matter has received the tacit approval of Mr. Fool, so it's bound to succeed. However, Old Man doesn't know much about the Tarot Club. Mr. Fool is a witness most of the time, so there's no so-called tacit approval. Leonard mumbled inwardly before diverting the topic. Why doesn't this saying feel complete? He had never informed Pallas Zaros of the exact situation of the Tarot Club. All he did was give mention of the general situation of the Tarot Club and inform him of the matters that had been approved by Mr. Fool. Pallas chuckled and said, "Indeed, there's also a second half of the saying, do not trust their benevolence. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence." Leonard repeated in silence as he looked down at the notebook with a bronze hardcover. He then muttered wistfully, "This is really akin to a Grade 1 sealed artifact. Furthermore, resolving its negative effects is relatively simple." Before this operation, consideration was given to the fact that beyonders of the pathway involving the moon domain, as well as the darkness, had relatively stronger resistance against nightmare-related effects. Leonard had originally planned on borrowing creeping hunger from the world Klein Moretti. However, after some subsequent discussion, Miss Magician mentioned the traits of Leymano's travels, giving him a better option. Hence, Klein, who was originally responsible for Angel's embrace, lent him creeping hunger for 3 hours. Various useful beyonder powers were recorded, such as bribe weaken. "This is something from the Abraham family," Pallas Zaros said with a sigh. Leonard had long known of this as he nodded indiscernibly. He then asked, "Old man, do you have the means of weakening or controlling the negative effects of the mystical item I previously mentioned?" "You call that a mystical item? That's something that requires sealing," Pallas first reprimanded Leonard. Then he said, "Didn't you say that it has a living characteristic? That makes it much easier to resolve." Leonard felt relieved as he cast his gaze out the window again, taking in the sight of St. Ireland Cathedral, which had parts resembling factories. In Phelps Street, North Borough, in the vicinity of St. Samuel Cathedral, at the entrance of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. After changing her clothes, Audrey got off a carriage like an ordinary girl. She had already gotten rid of her paperboy attire at a hotel room that had been prepared ahead of time, and that room was reserved by someone under Emlyn's instructions. It had nothing to do with her. At this moment, there were people coming and going at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation's entrance, but Audrey walked over without any hesitation. No one looked at her, as though she lived in another world. Audrey briskly walked into the foyer, went up to the second story, and headed for the director's office. And everyone who she walked past seemed to join her in playing a game, pretending as though they hadn't seen her. They weren't puzzled about why this unfamiliar girl was inside. Audrey was just about to enter the office when she suddenly heard a familiar voice inside. "Miss Audrey, this is the amount of donations we have gathered this week." Audrey couldn't help but curl the ends of her lips as she gently nudged the ajar door and walked in. Inside the office, a staff member was holding a stack of documents, showing it to the person behind the desk. Sitting behind the desk was a golden retriever with a pair of gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. It sat at the director's seat, casually flipping through the documents and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." The staff member then took back the document and smiled at the golden retriever. "Then I'll take my leave, Miss Audrey." Behind her, Audrey held back her laughter as she walked to the sofa. She silently watched the staff member leave without interrupting the golden retriever from reading the other documents. Susie seriously read the different documents, afraid that something wrong would happen to her acting, thus affecting Audrey's matters. After a while, she suddenly looked around in puzzlement. "Audrey, are you back? How did you notice?" Audrey stood up from the sofa and appeared within Susie's sights. For this operation, she had specially spoken to Susie. She got the latter to replace her at work in the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Then, with the golden retriever in tow, she hypnotized all the staff members who would interact with her that day, making them treat Susie as Audrey. As for any possible visitors, she told her staff that there would only be guests in the afternoon. And the signal to snap out of the hypnosis was the cathedral bells at 2 in the afternoon. Susie jumped off the chair after seeing Audrey, saying in exasperation, "It's almost 2. That's right." Audrey inwardly made a silly face as she rushed into the small lounge and changed into her clothes. She then used Lai's flame-controlling powers to bum her previous disguise. After returning to her office and sitting at her seat, she felt completely relaxed. She clasped her hands together and lightly pursed her lips. To be frank, she had always been nervous. However, she had successfully cast Placate on herself before the operation, preventing any slip-ups. It's quite interesting now that I reminisce over it. We even discussed how we would compensate those who were affected. Audrey, well done. A smile beamed on the blonde, green-eyed beauty as it grew brighter. After this operation, she realized that her hypnotist potion had digested by a significant amount. Furthermore, she had also confirmed one thing. The mystical item, Hand of Horror, which came with bribe charm, worked perfectly with hypnosis. Yes, I also learned that Mr. Moon's name is Emlyn White. He didn't bother hiding the matter because he had to tell me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have achieved our goals. Yes. Perhaps just giving the name of the cathedral was enough, but that will still expose his identity. I'm still feeling some anxiety. I was too stiff when hypnotizing. I actually used words that were too direct during the first level of hypnosis. Audrey cast Placate on her slightly agitated feelings as she reviewed the entire operation, hoping that she could draw from the experience and lessons of today. Gong, gong. St. Samuel Cathedral's bells chimed, indicating that it was 2 in the afternoon. Many staff who were inside 22 Phelps Street at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation had their bodies tremble after hearing it. Following that, they continued with their work as though nothing had happened. Gong, gong. Amidst the cathedral's bells, Klein, who had transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, once again walked to 160 Bachland Street's balcony and took in the situation of Mac's house. At this moment, a carriage passed by his residence's entrance and drove to the end of the street. Suddenly, Klein felt his perception trigger as a scene surfaced in his mind. A gray rat was leaning against the carriage's window, leisurely watching the street scenery. 1004 Third Movement Gray Rat. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't hesitate to turn back into his half-open room, leave the balcony, and enter the master bedroom. He then entered the bathroom. He moved at an adequate pace, doing so as though he had been repeating this entire process like a daily routine. Locking the bathroom's door, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and passed through the gray fog filled with ravings and roars, finally taking his seat on the high-backed chair of the fool. And before this, he made his valet, Inuni, who was standing by the corridor, softly pray to see God Calvatua. Using the corresponding point of light, he beckoned for the sea god scepter and began expanding his vision. He then locked onto the carriage that was driving towards Mac's residence 39 Backlund Street. And this time, the person leaning against the glass window and leisurely taking in the scenery was no longer a gray rat but a young man wearing a silk top hat and black trench coat. He had black hair and black eyes. His face was thin with a broad forehead. He wore a crystal monocle and had a faint smile on his lips. He was none other than the blasphemer, the angel of time, son of the creator Ammon. Although Klein was already mentally prepared, his anxiety made his entire body feel chilly. Ammon had clearly appeared in his original form, but after stealing the rat demigod's destiny, he appeared as a gray rat in everyone's eyes without incurring any suspicion. He and his brother, angel of imagination Adam, had certain powers which were similar. It left terror in the mind of others the more they thought about it, but it was intrinsically different. If not for the gray fog and not for my deeper control of this place, I wouldn't have discovered it either. Klein felt a mix of joy and alarm as he expanded his vision to seek out Ammon's avatars. Compared to the grafting of destiny, the signs of parasitizing was a lot clearer. However, Klein didn't notice anything this time. Be it the other passengers in the carriage, the horses that towed the carriage, or the surrounding trees and air, there wasn't any sign of parasitizing. This is different from what Leonard's grandpa said. Shouldn't the appearance of one Ammon mean the accompaniment of many more Ammons? He is clearly aware that he was discovered by a bizarro sorcerer of the Church of Evernight, and he suspects that Backlund Street is under surveillance. Therefore, he only sent a single avatar to investigate the situation. Klein frowned as he came up with theories. He was a little unsure of how to handle the current development. Of course, he recalled Pallas Zarost mentioning that as long as one avatar was resolved, he could eliminate all the Ammons in Backlund Street. And now there was only one Ammon in Backlund Street, a perfect time to take action. I'll first hear what the expert's opinion is. Klein immediately conjured the world Jam and Sparrow's figure at the other end of the long bronze table and made him reverently and piously pray. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Leonard Mitchell that Ammon has appeared at 39 Backlund Street, but there's only one. While Jam and Sparrow made the prayer, Klein didn't stop monitoring the carriage. He saw Hazel in a light-colored dress alight and enter her foyer. Ammon, who was wearing a monocle and black trench coat, walked behind her with complete composure. Despite not having any concealment, the servants didn't notice him at all. It was as though there was only air or some inconspicuous creature behind Miss Hazel. Occasionally, the female servants would look at the ground and jump in fright. Just as they were about to scream, they would forget what they were about to do after their mouths opened. Ammon passed through the foyer and walked up the stairs. Pinching the crystal monocle, Ammon stuffed his hands into his pockets. Ringed transparent worms began squirming out of his body as they crawled in every direction before vanishing. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He recalled Pallas Zarost's description of Ammon's parasitizing power, a plague-like infection. Hazel had been in an excellent mood recently. This was because her teacher hadn't truly gone mad. Everything that happened previously was only a test, and she had passed it with flying colors. This made her gain plenty of knowledge about the supernatural world. She learned the essence of the potions and grasped the acting method. She also gained the opportunity to advance to cryptologist. She was currently a sequence 7 Beyonder, so the world actually has such a magical side to it. I wonder when I can become a demigod and shake off my mortal coils. Hazel glanced at the hanging wall clock and rubbed her sunken tummy. She decided to get her mother to bring forward the high tea session today. After all, there weren't any guests. At noon, she had used the excuse of heading out for a meal to bring her teacher back. She also took the opportunity to act and hadn't had anything to eat. Upon thinking that, she glanced at her teacher, who was sprawled on a leather cushion on the sofa. The gray rat had raised its front paw and pressed on its right eye. "Do you need any food?" Hazel asked reverently. The rat lowered its front paw and answered unhurriedly, "There's no need." "All right, teacher." Hazel turned around and walked forward, opening the door to her bedroom. Her lady's maid was standing along the corridor, leisurely looking at the balcony at the end of the corridor as though she was admiring the afternoon sky. Hazel indiscernibly frowned and said, "Guard this place. Don't let anyone in." The lady's maid shot one glance at her and smiled. "Yes, miss." Only then did Hazel leave her bedroom and head for the activity room on the second story. She found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna. This lady with the same black-green hair received a pair of gem-embedded glasses with a gold chain hanging from it from her lady's maid. It was more an accessory than an eyesight correction tool. "Don't tell me that you don't like it," Hazel asked in puzzlement. The corners of Ma'am Rihanna's mouth curled slightly. "I like it now." As she said that, she wore the glasses. As Hazel was just about to say something, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned her head to find her father, Member of Parliament Mact, coming home early. "Father, didn't you say that you'd be at the military veterans' mess?" Hazel asked in passing. "There wasn't anyone there today." Mact raised his right hand and pinched the two sides of his eyes. Hazel thought nothing of it as she nodded. "Perfect. We haven't had high tea together in a long time." "That's right." Member of Parliament Mact and Ma'am Rihanna laughed at the same time as a faint smile appeared on their lips. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard, who had just returned from St. Ireland Square, threw himself onto the sofa as he lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Having not received any information, he believed that the punishment operation had come to a perfect end, allowing him to look forward to the spoils of war. "Old man, didn't you say that the Sanguine Viscount had many mystical items on him? Can you tell me what they are?" Leonard softly asked in puzzlement. In his mind, Pallas Zarost harumphed. "Items of that level aren't worth my notice." Leonard was just about to press further when his vision suddenly blurred. He saw the boundless grayish-white fog and Jam and Sparrow's blurry figure as well as his prayer. "Ammon has appeared at 39 Bachland Street, but there's only one." "Ammon has appeared." That quickly. Leonard, who had already relaxed, retracted his feet immediately and sat straight up. He became more anxious than before the punishment operation began. He hurriedly informed Pallas Zarost of Klein's words and asked, "Old man, what do we do now?" "Begin the operation, but there's only one Ammon avatar." Pallas Zarost fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "If there's only one Ammon, it implies that he has other motives, but none of that matters. In the fourth epoch, there's a saying, there's no point crying over spilled milk. Since it has begun, we can't falter. If we delay this any further, Ammon will attempt to influence the entire street. When that happens, he will definitely discover Dwayne Dante's abnormality." Klein returned to the real world and walked out of the bathroom. He had already made the corresponding preparations. He had creeping hunger on his left hand and an emblem carved from obsidian in his right. Then he made Inuni snap his fingers and use flaming jump to enter 39 Bachland Street Member of Parliament Mac's house with the appearance of Jam and Sparrow. Control of the spirit-body threads was instantly transferred to Klein, but this only seemed to sink into the vast ocean without any reaction. He had lost control of his marionette. Klein's eyelid twitched as he heard the door to the master bedroom creak open. It was Inuni. This youth with Lone and Balem blood in him had pushed open the door and walked in, completely outside of Klein's control. He then took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and rubbed it with his sleeve. Then he leisurely wore it on his right eye. He then looked at Dwayne Dante's, the corners of his mouth curling up. "Found you." The mood in the bedroom froze as Inuni, who was pinching on the monocle, continued. Flora Jacobs' destiny was filled with too many abnormalities, and they mainly came from this street. This piqued my interest, and I spent some time to distinguish and seek out the source. It took me so many days to find you. I'm no stranger to this mirror, and I can control it, but I've never seen it ingratiate itself so much towards one person. This really is an interesting matter. Perhaps I should steal your destiny and see why that is the case. Ah, right. You likely do not know of its origins. It's in no way simple. 1005 fourth movement wearing a monocle, Ammon, who wore the appearance of Inuni, didn't seem like an infiltrator or assailant. Instead, he appeared like a visitor as he eagerly mentioned all the preparations he had done, as well as Arod's origins. He paused before he could finish his sentence. Dwayne Dante's opposite him had turned into a dirty gray rat. The rat raised its right claw, pressing at its eye. At the same time, in the garden of 160 Bachland Street, with his thin and cut, black-haired, brown-eyed face, J.M. Sparrow appeared in the middle of a bunch of roses. Back when Ammon was saying something highly enticing, he had secretly split off a worm of time in an attempt to invade Klein's body in order to parasitize him. However, Klein had been on high alert the entire time. He detected this attempt via the changes in his spirit-body threads, so he rapidly created a marionette at the critical moment and swapped locations. Silently, Ammon, who looked like a mixed-blood youth, appeared in front of Klein. Behind him, a 12-ring transparent worm fell from the third story and returned to his body. And at that instant, the earthworms in the garden soil, the insects in the woods, the rats in the shadows all crawled out, either swarming towards J.M. Sparrow and Ammon or were fleeing from this region. The main reason why Klein had patiently listened to Ammon was to use that time to create marionettes. To a bizarro sorcerer, they were only complete with their marionettes. Ammon still wasn't in a rush to take action. He pinched the monocle embedded deep in his eye socket and looked around, saying with a smile, "Your actions often expose your problems. To a master of deceit, everything that you did was enough for me to detect your weakness. In such a tense and dangerous situation, you actually chose to convert rats, insects, birds, and earthworms into being your marionettes without considering your servants. What does this tell me? It says that you have outstanding moral standards. You still view yourself as human and are unwilling to harm them. Upon grasping this point, even if my avatar is inferior to you, it's still easy to break you down. You wouldn't even be capable of dying even if you wish for it. Ah, right. You can stop your attempts at secretly controlling my spirit-body threads. This is because you're controlling the spirit-body threads I stole. They belong to your butler, your maid, and your coachman. If this continues, I'm afraid you will feel a deep sense of guilt. Even spirit-body threads can be stolen. No, it's more like grafting." Klein's expression froze slightly as he terminated his control of Ammon's spirit-body threads. He had been patient, allowing Ammon to drone on with his drivel, mainly doing so because he was secretly trying to turn Ammon's avatar into his marionette. To a bizarro sorcerer, battles like this, where he stalled for time and exerted his influence in secret, should have been something he was best at and something he enjoyed the most. Unfortunately, he had encountered blasphemer Ammon, the current pinnacle existence of the Marauder Pathway. Even if he was only facing an avatar, he could do nothing about him. Klein actually suspected that Ammon's words were a ruse, but he wasn't able to see through it. He didn't dare take the risk. During such times, he needed the help of a spectator. For you to say so much, I doubt it solely to think of the means to parasitize me right. You should know that, before severely injuring me, it's very difficult to parasitize a bizarro sorcerer who can see spirit-body threads, Klein calmly said as he wore Jayaman Sparrow's face. Ammon immediately chortled. You finally noticed it. You're trying to steal my destiny. Klein swapped locations with a marionette once again, constantly making his actual body appear in different corners of the garden. No. Ammon shook his head, keeping his hands in his pockets while leisurely saying with a smile, if a magic mirror like Arrows is willing to listen to your instructions and deliberately ingratiate itself towards you, it means that you aren't as simple as I imagined. I'm not a beyonder of the tyrant pathway, so I wouldn't be so rash as to directly steal your destiny. Heh heh. I suddenly have a feeling that directly replacing you would result in something I don't wish to see happening. How did you know Arrows is ingratiating itself? Flora Jacobs' destiny shouldn't have something like that. Klein appeared on a tree. His different marionettes continued changing their locations. Ammon pulled out one hand and pinched his chin and said, "Didn't I say why? I spent time to gather information and seek out the source. Oh, I went to the Church of Steam and had a chat with Arrows. It wasn't too frank, and it was willing to be tortured by me rather than reveal your true origins. Unfortunately, that was inside the Church of Steam. Otherwise, I would have directly parasitized it and learned of everything. Even living sealed artifacts can be parasitized. If Arrows strictly abided by the rules based on its answers in the past, he isn't too sure of my actual situation and only has certain guesses." Klein's eyes widened. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Ammon laugh and say, "You really don't seem to be in a rush. What are you waiting for? Do you not know that my Pathways Sequence 2's name is Trojan Horse of Destiny? Although I'm only an ordinary avatar, I do have some powers that I can use, such as tinkering with your destiny, making certain errors appear for a certain period of time. For instance, no one will notice it no matter how much you cry for help." Heh heh, that also means that, even if you were to trigger the Evernight emblem in your hand, you will only be able to get the effects of concealment, and you will not be able to transmit your intentions of seeking help, regardless of your prior agreements. Also, even if you were to shout for help or create an explosion, the pedestrians and servants in the room wouldn't be able to hear a thing. This is the reason why I was talking so much. For an ordinary avatar, certain matters take time. All right, it's your turn to answer my question. Klein didn't answer as he kept switching positions with his marionettes. However, Ammon kept appearing in front of him as they continued their conversation. At this moment, he made one of his marionettes ask, "Since you've already completed the controlling of destiny, why aren't you taking action? You also seem to be waiting." Before this Jayaman Sparrow, who was a thin paper figurine, could finish his sentence, there was a strong gust of wind from afar. Leonard, in a black trench coat and a black silver-inlaid cane in hand, flew to Bachland Street. Klein, who had appeared to Ammon's side, immediately said, "This is what I've been waiting for." As he said that, he triggered the Evernight emblem that he had been clasping tightly. Simultaneously, he snapped his left hand's fingers, igniting the tallest tree in the garden, making its scarlet flames soar into the sky. And this huge, obvious bonfire that would have been noticeable at a glance from across the street was noticed by no one, be it the maids wiping the windows on the first story or the pedestrians strolling beneath the Inti's parasol trees. Even in midair, Leonard Mitchell ignored this scene, rushing for 39 Bachland Street at high speeds. And at this moment, Palace Zarost's slightly aged voice sounded in this Red Gloves' mind. "Turn back. Head to Unit 160. Although Leonard was puzzled, his experienced self didn't ask why when it came to supernatural matters. He immediately swung the direction word of the sea pointed and changed directions. In the garden of 160 Bachland Street, Ammon raised his head as he pressed the crystal monocle on his right hand, chuckling. "This is also what I've been waiting for." He ignored Jam and Sparrow as his smile grew obvious. He continued speaking in irresistible delight, to be able to discover the abnormalities of fate in this region. "It's him, Perilous." As he spoke, this blasphemer changed his actions and adjusted his monocle. At this moment, a strange gloom fell over the entire street. It was as though the entire place had been separated from reality, turning into a secret. In the activity room of 39 Bachland Street, Hazel looked out the window and muttered in puzzlement, "Is it about to rain?" This wasn't anything important, so she retracted her gaze and reached out her hand onto the three-layered tray for high tea. Then she saw her father, Member of Parliament Mact, strangely open his right palm. Glimmers of light condensed out of thin air, forming into a crystal monocle in his palm. Mac then wore this monocle on his right eye. Hazel had already sensed something amiss as she frantically looked at the others in the room. Her mother, Ma'am Rihanna, took off the accessory on her nose and wore a monocle that she had taken out of somewhere. The servants standing beside her all took out a similar monocle and wore it on their right eye. Thud! Hazel stood up instinctively as she retreated repeatedly, toppling the chair over in the process. This sound alarmed everyone in the room. Mact, Rihanna, and the servants turned their heads to look at Hazel. Bit by bit, a smile suffused the comers of their lips. "Ah!" Hazel broke down as she let out a shrill scream. This scream passed through the house and through the garden, drawing the attention of the pedestrians on the streets. At this point, Ammon had already lowered his right hand from his monocle. Looking at the figure in midair, he said with a smile, "Perilous, it's already 1350 of the fifth epoch. The technique of relying on the gathering of avatars to raise one's level is already outdated." Behind him, Klein didn't waste any time as he reached into his pocket as though he was drawing a gun while he made creeping hunger turn transparent. A transparent book condensed in front of him. However, Ammon simply raised his hand and the glove vanished. However, along with the human-skinned glove's disappearance, Jam and Sparrow also did. Landing in Ammon's palm wasn't a glove but a rat that had died after becoming a marionette. On the other side of Ammon, Klein, who wasn't wearing a hat but was wearing a shirt and vest, appeared. He then threw out the item he had previously taken out, and he threw it at his target. It was a paper crane. Thank you for listening to the story on KevinAudio.com 1006 finale, and ending it was an ordinary paper crane, bursting into scarlet red flames just as it flew out, scattering ashes in the process. Ammon, who had been looking up into the sky, suddenly turned his head and looked at the paper crane, who was a vessel of flames. He then raised his palm again. A cold glint had lit up in the eye beneath the monocle. Suddenly, the flames on the paper crane's surface vanished. Klein and his ability to swap locations with his marionette vanished. Likewise for flame controlling, flaming jump, and air cannon. In that instant, he had 6 Beyonder powers stolen, 4 of which were rather important ones. If Ammon was able to make a few more thefts, then Klein might have even turned into an ordinary person. This was theft at the angel level. Amidst the extinguishing flames, the paper crane slowly floated. Backlund, Dr. Aaron's house in a black pram. Wrapped in silver silk, Will Ossipton rubbed his mouth and eyes, grumbling, "Life is just so hard." Before he finished his sentence, he took out what looked like a cane from somewhere. It was embedded with clear gems. Pure bright light lit up, illuminating the calendar in the room clearly. Today was Tuesday 160 Bachland Street, inside Dwayne Dante's garden. The paper crane, which was already charred and incomplete, suddenly froze in midair. Complicated chrome-colored symbols appeared out of it, instantly taking on the form of a huge, illusory, scaleless snake. The dense patterns and symbols on the surface of the gigantic silver snake formed a wheel that was connected to each other. Around each wheel were different symbols. With a sweep of the cold, bright red eyes, this giant serpent soared into the sky and stayed above Bachland Street. It curled its body and bit its own tail. Its shadow blanketed the entire street like a mysterious and ludicrous wheel. Suddenly, Macht, Rihanna, and several servants in 39 Bachland Street's activity room wiped the smiles from their faces. They raised their hands in unison, taking off the monocle on their faces, allowing the monocles to turn incorporeal in their hands before transforming into beams of light. Immediately following that, they wore their eye accessories once again and pinched their eye sockets, either leisurely looking out the window or returning to their former state. Hazel sat on the ground watching this scene. As she shook her head, feeling the world crumbling around her, she used her hands to hold her body up while rapidly retreating. The cold glimmer in Winter Inuni's eyes vanished. The crystalline monocle was left cooked, and he no longer wore that supercilious look. In addition, something in his body seemed to be extracted as a clear, thick, but transparent and mysterious worm of time took form above his head. And amidst concealment, this worm of time quickly transformed into a figure with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face. This wasn't time reversing itself on Bachland Street, because Klein and Leonard didn't suffer any of its effects. It was Ammon having his condition return to a few minutes prior to this. Snake of Fate. Reboot. Although Will Ossipton had predicted that there would be some changes in fate, things had happened slightly later. However, his influence that descended from afar came in such a timely fashion. In order to gain this Snake of Fate's help, Klein had not only fed him 5 different flavors of ice cream, but he had also agreed to further compensation. The outcome of their negotiation was that Klein had to think of the means to create at least 2 items that could allow Will Ossipton to briefly regain some of his strength while in his weakened state. When Ammon suffered this unexpected blow, Klein didn't hesitate and drew death knell. He cocked it, gently pushed the cylinder, and aimed it at his enemy. Bang! He staidly and decisively pulled death knell's trigger, shooting out the control spirit bullet he had long prepared. A black stream of light flashed out, striking the illusory Ammon figure with the sharp bonnet and classic black robe, the Worm of Time. This was even thicker and clearer than all the Worms of Time Klein had previously seen before. The light scattered as Ammon's figure quivered in midair and froze without being able to wear any expression. And at this moment, Leonard, who had already arrived overhead, followed Old Man's instructions. Standing on Word of the Sea, he floated in midair, slightly spread out his arms, and relaxed his spirit body. Both his green eyes immediately reflected a slightly gloomy, 12-ringed transparent worm of time in each one of them. These 2 worms of time had their heads and tails connected together, forming a similar loop. As the loop slowly spun, they projected a huge ancient mottled illusion behind Leonard. This illusion looked like the surface of a wall clock carved from stone. There were 12 segments. Each segment was either grayish-white or bluish-black. They were clearly demarcated from each other, and the symbols were all different. With just one look, Klein had the feeling that life was speeding past him. Gong. A bell gong that seemed to travel across time from ancient history resounded through the spacious secret world. Everything before Klein seemed to slow down, including the Ammon figure above Inuni. An indescribable invisible surge appeared, sweeping around that Ammon figure before hurling it towards that huge, illusory stone-carved wall clock. What was actually a worm of time, Ammon's avatar with a monocle, suddenly extended a hand, aiming it at Jayaman Sparrow. Suddenly, Klein saw the skin on the back of his hand rapidly dry up as they wrinkled up, producing unobvious aged spots. The speed at which Ammon's illusory figure was being pulled away slowed down, but the process couldn't be interrupted. Finally, it contracted into the form of a ringed worm and was thrown towards the illusory, ancient stone-carved wall clock behind Leonard. Gong. Another bell gong sounded as the grayish-white and bluish-black clock's surface had an additional mottled hand. This hand quickly rotated a few segments, speeding up the sound of the gongs. Inside 39 and 160 Bachland Street, all kinds of resplendent glimmers of light flew out, pulled and attracted by that ancient, illusory, stone-carved wall clock. Law of Bayonder characteristics convergence. He had used the connection between the avatars and his higher level to strengthen the law of Bayonder characteristic convergence. Gong. Several streams of light from different spots in Bachland flew over. After everything calmed down, Klein's current appearance appeared in his mind. He had more white hair than black. His forehead and the corners of his mouth and eyes were covered with obvious wrinkles. His skin had sagged with several aged spots. He looked like an elderly gentleman, ready to pass away at any moment. At this moment, the clock's gonging sounded again. The grayish-white hand on the ancient, illusory stone-carved wall clock began spinning counterclockwise. 1 tick, 2 ticks, 3 ticks. Klein saw his skin rapidly recover its luster as the spots faded and vanished. In just seconds, he recovered his original appearance. Life had seemed to begin flowing in him again. Powers at the angel level are almost godlike. I only suffered some repercussions of it, and I nearly died of old age. I wonder if I can revive under such conditions. Klein observed his condition and hurriedly looked up and said to Leonard Mitchell, "How should the people parasitized by Ammon be rescued?" At this moment, the ancient, illusory clock behind Leonard rapidly faded away, turning into glimmers of light that drilled back into his body. Leonard cocked his head slightly as though he was listening to something. After a while, he said, "The Bayonder characteristics of the worms of time in them have been sucked out. The remaining parts have either been absorbed or have some remnants left behind. However, it wouldn't result in having an excessive influence on them." Old man said that it won't be excessive, but it might be from the viewpoint of an angel. In short, they can pray to the deities they believe in and see if they can obtain a complete purification. However, without them explaining what exactly happened, the deities might not give a response. If you're afraid of any remnant effects, you can consider guiding them to pray to that existence. All the items that come from that will be yours. Perhaps having personally experienced a battle at the angel level, and having seen the snake of fate's spectral form, Leonard's agitation and trembling could hardly be suppressed in an instant. The people on this street are basically the believers of the goddess, so how can I get them to pray to the fool? I don't wish to be thrown into the foggy town. The goddess is very aware of this matter. They will likely receive a response if they were to pray to her. Then, I can get Her Eminence Ariana to return the worms of time that they cough out to me. I can give her some. As Klein's thoughts raced, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He then asked in passing, will there be any side effects after a complete purification? Although he had some experience from Little Sun, this youth of the City of Silver wasn't an ordinary person. After listening for a moment, Leonard said, "A little. As it's a deeper level of parasitizing, even if ordinary people were to experience a full recovery, there will be some level of influence left on them, such as them liking to wear monocles. All right, head back first. Leave the rest to me." Klein nodded and was glad that the parties involved in this battle weren't the kinds with obvious destructive might. Otherwise, it might not only be Bachland Street, but all of North Borough might not be left intact. In Pritz Harbor, a black-haired, black-eyed, thin-faced young man wearing a monocle rode on a bicycle as he leisurely returned home. He wore an obvious smile as he opened the letterbox and took out the newspapers and letters inside. After entering the house, the young man pinched the monocle on his right eye while tearing open the letters, reading their contents as he walked. This continued until he found a letter without any name on it. If all connection to us in Backland is lost, it means that Palace Zarost might very well be hidden in the vicinity of Northborough's Backland Street. Don't ask us why we're taking such risks. Life often requires some excitement, joy, and anticipation. 1. Author's note. To make the plot run smoothly, the details of a tarot gathering was skipped. As for Will's prediction, a deviation happened because of Ammon's ability to bore through fate. 1007. Dealing with the aftermath on 160 Backland Street. After watching Leonard fly out of the world of concealment with the word of the sea in one hand, Klein turned his attention back onto his surroundings. He first observed Winner Inuni. He originally imagined that he couldn't use the marionette that had been parasitized by Ammon, but to his surprise, he realized that he could control his spirit-body threads again. Klein was first stunned before he came to a realization. When Snake of Fate Will Ossipton used Reboot to reverse Ammon's condition in time, it also made the things he parasitized experience similar changes. Hence, Inuni had turned back into his marionette. As expected of the strongest power of a monster pathways sequence 1. Klein heaved a sigh of relief before allowing his figure to fade away from where he stood. He teleported back to his master bedroom, leaving a bunch of marionettes around to defend against any accidents. Right on the heels of that, Klein entered the bathroom and headed above the gray fog. He used Inuni's prayer light and began observing the entire street with the sea god scepter in hand. Without a doubt, his focus was on his residence and Unit 39. He found Butler Walter, Housekeeper Tanja, Member of Parliament Mact, Ma'am Rihanna, and many servants having remnant signs of being parasitized. They appeared somewhat in a daze. As for Hazel, she was on the brink of total collapse. Her hands were on the ground, having pushed herself backwards into the corner. Her back was leaning close to the wall as she huddled into a ball, trembling. Mact and company had noticed something wrong with her. They surrounded her in concern, hoping to know why. However, Hazel would scream loudly whenever they attempted to approach her. She would resist violently, so all they could do was stand meters away, wearing a panicked and helpless look. During this process, they would, from time to time, nudge their glasses or pinch their eye sockets. This only served to leave Hazel even more horrified. She appeared to be on the brink of losing control. Klein felt horrified when he saw this scene above the gray fog. He imagined a scene. Daddy Ammon, Mommy Ammon, Maid Ammon, Footman Ammon were circling around Hazel, trying to soothe her nerves but were helpless. They wore the same expression and the same monocle with different clothes. Even if Hazel were to hold out and not lose control, she would definitely develop mental problems. At the very least, she would be in a half-crazy state. Klein's thoughts raced as he lowered the sea god scepter and returned to the real world. Backland Street and the several streets remained enshrouded in darkness. It exuded a serene, tranquil, and profound feeling. This was a world that had already turned into a secret. Klein took down a hat, wore it on his head, and teleported to a director's office in 22 Phelps Street Loan Charity Bursary Foundation. Audrey had already changed into a light green dress and was daydreaming with a fountain pen in hand, reminiscing over every detail of the punishment operation in the afternoon. Susie, on the other hand, had gone out for a stroll. Suddenly, this noble lady sensed something and looked up. A black-haired, brown-eyed, thin-faced figure with cut facial features was rapidly reflected in her emerald, limpid eyes. This figure wore a white shirt, black vest, black trousers, and black leather boots. He had a cold expression. His body was bent slightly as he held one hand over his top hat. Audrey was first taken aback before she recalled who this person was. Jamin Sparrow. Although she had never met him before, she had already seen his extremely lifelike picture on the papers and wanted posters. Klein realized that he hadn't changed back to Dwayne Dantes based on Miss Justice's reaction. However, he wasn't too mindful of that. He released his hand from his top hat and straightened his body. He said with a nod, "There's something that requires your help." His disguise had also been stolen by Ammon, but after a reboot, it was returned to him. He just didn't have the time to change back into Dwayne Dantes. "Mr. World, who's already a demigod, needs my help. He's in need of therapy because of some mental problem." "No, it doesn't seem to be the case." Audrey pursed her lips as she put down her fountain pen in anticipation and curiosity. She stood up and gave a serious reply. "No problem." Klein didn't waste any time and walked over. Grabbing her by the arm, their figures faded away as they vanished from the spot. Instantaneously, they appeared outside the activity room at 39 Bachland Street. "This is teleportation." Audrey's eyes turned slightly as she instinctively wanted to ask something. However, when she felt the heavy atmosphere and the screams, her face immediately wore a solemn look. "There's a patient?" she asked without much doubt. "It's really easy to talk to a spectator. There's no need for much explanation." Klein tersely acknowledged and said, "Yes, she encountered a supernatural incident and suffered a terrible fright. She's on the brink of losing control. Do you have the means to not be seen by the people inside?" There was no need for him to say his last sentence, as a large-scale illusion was enough to resolve the problem. Furthermore, after receiving the blessings of concealment, ordinary people likely didn't retain much of their corresponding memories. However, after witnessing Adam's powers of invisibility, Klein was rather curious if Miss Justice had such skills at Sequence 6. "Mr. World is feeling curious. That's really rare. He doesn't seem to be wearing a thick mask and has changed to a thinner one. He's a really good patient who heeds medical advice." Audrey's chin moved slightly as she nodded. "Yes." As she spoke, she glanced at Jam and Sparrow, who reached out for the handle and pushed open the door after receiving her response. Member of Parliament Mact and Ma'am Rihanna completely ignored this beautiful girl as they discussed in a panic about hiring a doctor. As for Hazel, she remained curled in a corner, trembling vigorously like an abandoned baby animal. Miss Hazel. As a senior spectator, Audrey didn't have the problem of forgetting others. She observed Hazel's condition and frowned slightly. She turned her head and said to Jam and Sparrow, Mr. Sparrow, can you briefly explain what she encountered?" "Only with sufficient knowledge can I quickly resolve the problem." Klein was already prepared as he quickly and succinctly explained. "She's a beyonder of the Marauder Pathway, a student of a demigod who had nefarious thoughts. Her teacher attracted blasphemer Ammon's avatar and ended up getting herself killed. Her destiny and identity were stolen. As such, Ammon infiltrated her family, parasitizing her parents and servants. Just now, while we were eliminating Ammon's avatars, she realized that her parents and servants had all turned into Ammon. She didn't know that that was Ammon, but she understood that it was a strange existence. If you have anything you wish to understand at a deeper level, things which do not involve the psychological treatment, you can always ask during the next gathering." Blasphemer Ammon. Mr. World and company have eliminated Ammon's avatar again. No avatars. Audrey was somewhat shocked as she instinctively glanced at Mact and company. She couldn't imagine that they had once been parasitized by Ammon and had turned into him. To have everyone parasitized. Audrey recalled Mr. World's words and felt more afraid the more she thought about it. She felt her entire body turn cold as she couldn't help but think of herself if she were in Hazel's shoes. This left her somewhat stifled as she subconsciously cast placate on herself. Is the supernatural world always this cruel and terrifying, or is it just occasionally? After calming down, Audrey muttered softly. She didn't wait for the World Jam and Sparrow's reply, because from what she had seen at the tarot gathering, she knew the answer very well, always. Looking back at Hazel, Audrey walked over, filled with pity. She crouched down and first used placate. Hazel looked up blankly and saw a perfect, flawless face as well as that pair of emerald-like eyes. At that instant, she seemed to return to the ball of that previous night, having witnessed this lady descend like an angel. She instantly calmed down. She saw ripples rise up in that pair of limpid green eyes. They were serene, calm, and deep. "There's no need to be afraid. Calm down. Everything is already over." Audrey used hypnosis to directly communicate with Hazel's body of heart and mind. She heard hysterical screams and the horror that was taller than mountains and deeper than the ocean. Taking into account Hazel's condition and encounter, she quickly came up with a plan for treatment. She directly hypnotized Hazel and made her forget today's encounter and the existence of her teacher. She was only capable of vaguely remembering her identity as a Beyonder and other general knowledge. Hazel gradually calmed down before she slowly fell asleep. After you awaken, that terrifying experience will no longer exist, and I was never here. Audrey used a gentle voice to complete the last step of the hypnosis. Following that, she slowly got up and observed Hazel for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and whispered without turning her head. I made her temporarily forget the corresponding memories, but that memory remains. It's just hidden deep down. In future gatherings, I'll continue treating her, guiding her to slowly remember and accept this memory. Only then can her mental problem be completely resolved. Otherwise, perhaps a familiar action or sentence will jolt her awake. She will then break down once again, and perhaps it will result in a direct loss of control. Miss Justice is becoming more and more professional. Klein sighed as he asked cautiously, "Then you will have to hypnotize all the people who were parasitized. They are not to show any hobbies that don't originally belong to them, like the wearing of monocles. Also, let them pray to the Evemite goddess after 15 minutes to obtain complete cleansing and purification." Audrey nodded with abnormal seriousness. "No problem." Klein immediately stood to the side, watching this noble lady, everyone who had been parasitized in this house with the greatest feelings of pity. 1008 splitting minutes later, Klein with the face of Jayaman Sparrow walked out of 39 Backlund Street with Miss Justice Audrey and headed for places where the other parasite victims were. After a few silent steps, Klein suddenly looked ahead and said, "It's not rare to see such matters happen among unaffiliated Beyonders. Without any suitable guidance, it often implies that they're constantly dancing at the edge of a cliff with the possibility of falling at any time." Audrey tersely acknowledged and said after a few seconds, "I know. Compared to before, I'm not as. She deliberated for a moment before breaking into a grimacing smile, as though she had found a suitable adjective she required to mock herself. "Naive. Phew." She then exhaled without hiding it as she looked ahead. "If I had known that the mysterious world was so cruel and terrifying last June, I might not have raised the request of becoming a Beyonder." Klein turned his head slightly and took a look at the noble lady's face. He asked in a seemingly casual manner, "If I were to give you the chance now to completely leave the mysterious world, would you accept it?" Audrey was taken aback as she slowly pursed her lips and said, "No." After giving such a response, she seemed to relax a little as she smiled and continued, "Under the premise of knowing how cruel and terrifying the mysterious world is, the me from last June would have given up being a Beyonder. But the me of this year wouldn't. This might be the price of growing up. I understand what you're getting at." Klein continued forward at the same pace as he said, "After those victims are completely purified, a number of them will spit out worms of time. They can be used to create fate siphon charms. It's a demigod-level item that can switch the fate between two parties for a short period of time. When the time comes, I'll give you one as payment for today's treatment." Audrey was about to decline it before she fell silent again. She then nodded gently and said, "Okay." Just as she said that, she suddenly paused. She turned her head to glance at Jam and Sparrow and smilingly said with a mixed expression, "I know why you just asked me that question." Klein chuckled without giving a direct answer. Audrey retracted her gaze and immediately felt a lot better. She asked as though they were having a chat, "I participated in the punishment operation at noon, and I dealt with the Ammon aftermath in the afternoon. Today is really a tarot day." Her words were a double entendre as she said with utmost wistfulness. From her point of view, noon was a cooperative operation that involved 5 members: the moon, the star, judgment, justice, and the magician with different levels of involvement. In the afternoon, the tarot clubs The World and Justice had involved themselves in the elimination of Ammon's avatars in different ways. This was indeed a day to remember, and in a sense, it could be considered a tarot day. Klein nodded in agreement at Miss Justice's words, but he didn't tell her that the star Leonard had also been involved in the afternoon operation. Furthermore, he was the main force in the operation. Ammon's avatar must have been difficult to deal with, right? Audrey finally found an opportunity to raise the question. She stared at Jam and Sparrow, making no attempt to hide the curiosity in her green eyes. Klein smiled. "If I had done it alone, you wouldn't be seeing Jam and Sparrow but Ammon here instead." "Having your destiny and identity stolen?" Audrey asked in enlightenment. Klein tersely acknowledged. "We'll discuss the specifics in the future. In short, to eliminate all of the Ammon avatars in Backland this time, we had mobilized angels. If you were to encounter Ammon's avatars in the future, never believe that you have the means to handle him alone. Immediately find an opportunity to seek help. Yes, his trait is the wearing of a monocle. He enjoys pulling off harrowing pranks." Angels were mobilized. "I wonder if it was that death consul or the angel from the fate domain, or—" Audrey looked up at the sky and saw the clouds frozen in midair. They appeared like props under the dark background. Like an attentive student listening to a teacher, she seriously nodded and said, "I will keep that in mind." The two continued walking, occasionally silent, occasionally breaking out into a conversation until they entered 160 Bachland Street. After a few minutes, inside the activity room of Hazel's house, Macht and company suddenly had the strong urge to sit in their seats, raise their hands, and place their clasped hands before their mouth. They then began to piously pray and chant the Evernight goddess's honorific name. After an unknown period of time, they coughed in unison until their tears and snot flowed out. Cough, cough, cough. Without realizing it, they separately coughed out worms with 12 translucent rings. The moment these worms fell to the ground, they vanished without gamering any notice. Similar things happened in other places of Bachland Street, but everything was quickly restored to normal. And the darkness had faded away at some point in time as the clouds began churning again from the sweeping winds. Amidst her parents' coughing, Hazel slowly regained consciousness. She was puzzled as to how she fell asleep on the sofa during high tea. She felt that she should have been in an excellent mood, but she just couldn't bring herself to smile. She felt as though there was a feeling of indescribable sadness and pain bearing over her heart. Upon seeing her parents' concerned gaze landing on her, not only wasn't she touched, she even felt a little fearful. She trembled like an introvert who wasn't accustomed to making contact with others. Hazel knew that this wasn't her personality, but she couldn't control herself. However, she didn't find it weird or puzzling as she continued enjoying the high tea pastries. Macht and Rihanna felt the same. They had a nagging feeling that there was something hazy about their memories, but they just couldn't recall what. 160 Bachland Street. In the master bedroom, which had its curtains drawn, a figure suddenly outlined itself across the coffee table. It was the barefooted Ariana, leader of the ascetics, matron of the Evernight cloister, head of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evemite. She was wearing a Spartan robe with tree bark as her belt. In the lady's eyes, the gray sideburn Dwayne Dantes was about to leave the sofa. On the coffee table in front of him were 9 transparent ringed worms. "Good afternoon, Ma'am Ariana," Klein said with a solemn bow. "Thanks to your help, Ammon's avatars in Backland have all been eliminated. You can choose a portion of these spoils of war." He had previously prepared a marionette beside every person who had been parasitized, and he used an illusion to bring these worms of time back. After hearing him, Ariana tapped her chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and replied in a pious manner, "Praise the lady." She didn't decline the offer or stand on ceremony. She reached out her right hand, and 2 worms of time flew up and landed in her palm. Ammon must have certain guesses about this. "You still have to be careful in the future," Ariana said simply before her figure vanished inch by inch as though she had been erased. Watching this archbishop leave, Klein sat down and picked up a pen and paper, writing to Leonard Mitchell. He wanted to ask what other effects the worms of time had other than creating fate siphon charms. He believed that he couldn't turn all the remaining worms of time into fate siphon charms, as it would be too monotonous. It made it easy to be countered, and it prevented him from handling different situations. Therefore, he had to consider other possible uses. With the worm of time as a vessel, he could use the powers stirred from other symbols, patterns, and labels that differed from the Fool. This would likely result in different effects from the fate siphon charm, and this was something Pallas Zarost was an expert at. After writing his letter, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew at it. Rionette walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed head in hand. The 8 eyes paused before looking at the remaining 7 worms of time on the coffee table. Miss Messenger looked at it for 3 full seconds before retracting her gaze. She then bit on the letter and gold coin which Klein handed over. "Still 7 Pinster Street," Klein succinctly said. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied in the future, "You can seek my help in such matters. The payment will be the spoils of war." Klein was taken aback as he said, "All right." After Miss Messenger returned to the spirit world and vanished from his room, he frowned and muttered, "Since she can recognize the worms of time, it means that she knows that this battle might have escalated to the level of angels. She wasn't afraid at all. Miss Messenger is stronger than I imagined." 7 Pinster Street. Leonard received Klein's letter from Rionette Tinker's mouth. He still felt a hint of excitement as he eagerly unfolded the letter and read it. After the messenger left, he immediately asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, there should be other ways to create charms, right? Just now, Pallas Zarost had given him 2 worms of time from Ammon as today's reward for the risk he took." In Leonard's mind, the slightly aged voice replied with a smiling tone, "Of course, once I sleep for a while and digest what we received this time, I'll teach you. It wouldn't take too long. Also, do not go to Bachland Street anytime soon." "Why?" Leonard asked in surprise. Pallas Zarost chuckled and said, "All of Ammon's avatars in Backland have been eliminated, and it is in no way a trivial matter. The number of people who can do that is just a handful. So do you think he will have some guesses?" Leonard's nerves tensed up again. Pallas continued, "However, there's no need to be too worried. His true body wouldn't be able to enter Backland, and having recovered quite significantly, I don't have to be too worried about his avatars. In addition, I've found a piece of information from Flora Jacob from his 1 memory fragments. Somewhere in Backland hides the treasure of the Jacob family. We shall wait until the end of the year for the gathering. There, we will seek out and cooperate with the other descendants of the Jacob family to excavate that treasure trove to share the items inside. When that happens, even if Ammon gathers a large number of avatars, raising it to almost the level of a sequence one, there's no way he can truly defeat me. Heh heh. To ensure balance, Dwayne Dantes can also be involved in it. 1009 payment is always exacted for what S bestowed. Leonard immediately felt very relieved when he heard Old Man Palace. He cast his attention back to the angel-level battle that happened in the afternoon and asked rather curiously, which Pathway's angel does that giant serpent phantom belong to? Pallas Zoroast fell silent for a moment before saying with a sigh, Snake of Fate, the counselor of the life school of thought, a sequence 1 angel. I never expected him to join them. Counselor of the life school of thought. He has also become a blessed of Mr. Fool. The corresponding card is the Wheel of Fortune. Leonard's eyes widened as he realized that Mr. Fool's faction seemed comparable to the 7 Orthodox churches. It was truly unfathomable. Death Consul, Snake of Fate, Incomplete Messenger. There are 3 angels under Mr. Fool. It's no wonder Klein was able to become a demigod so quickly. Just how long has it been, and I've already been embroiled in a battle at the angel level. It's really unimaginable how things will develop in the future. Leonard held the letter and sat on the sofa. He felt another sense of urgency towards digesting his Soul Assurer potion and advancing to Spirit Warlock. He had been busy placating the souls in the Backland region recently, but due to the numerous missions, he was still far from completing them. He couldn't find an excuse or opportunity to visit Tingen City to steal the powers from that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood. Furthermore, the arrival of Ammon's avatars had been quicker than he had expected. South of the bridge, Rose Street, Harvest Church. Emlyn White, who had changed into a brown priest robe, stood in front of a long table with candle stands. He watched Ernst Boyar working hard at wiping the altar before he raised his right hand and casually pointed. To the side. Left side. That spot's dirty. Ernst Boyar, who also wore the clergyman attire of the Earth Mother, shot an angry look at Emlyn, but he still listened to his instructions and re-wiped the area he hadn't wiped seriously. I know you're very mad. It's how I felt when I learned that you deliberately hid key information from the ancient castle until you sold me, Emlyn said with a smile, completely unfazed by his glare. Also, I forgot to inform you. I'm also a Viscount. It happened last week. Sanguine Viscounts corresponded to the Moon Pathway Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar. The advancement ritual required the illumination of the full moon. Apart from that, one had to gather different metals, gems, and Beyonder creature blood that represented the different moon phases. It was rather complicated. However, Emlyn had long obtained the promise from the sanguine upper echelons that a free advancement ritual would be held for him. He could advance easily once the full moon came. As for the digestion of potions professor, he had completed digesting it without putting too much effort into it. This was because he often taught commoners who were willing to learn at the Harvest Church to learn about herbs and medicine, and even combinations of some special potions. And apart from usually collecting dolls, researching history, and doing volunteer work at the cathedral, he loved thinking about the different potions and considering how they could be used in different battle situations. You're a Viscount. Ernst Boyar abruptly stood up straight as he wore a flabbergasted look. Among the sanguine, as they were all long-lived, they had quite a huge population. The number of Beyonder characteristics was limited, so advancing was a very difficult endeavor. One had to be in a long line before they had the opportunity to advance. However, Emlyn White had only been a baron for half a year. Ernst remembered that it took him 6 years to go from baron to Viscount. This was because his father had suffered an attack from artificial vampires. His passing left him the inheritance. Of course, Emlyn's smug smile grew obvious, but he remained restrained. I obtained a sequence 5 Beyonder characteristics from artificial vampires. Ernst Boyar looked at Emlyn, momentarily at a loss for words. He felt that he had suffered a heavier blow than needing to do volunteer work at the Harvest Church. Your expression is rather interesting." Emlyn tisked and said, "Perhaps one day you'll have to address me as Lord when I become an Earl." "Preposterous! What arrogance!" Ernst blurted. "I'm already very humble. I didn't mention I would become a duke or even a princeps. How am I to be the Sanguine's messiah without being an angel? Besides, in our tarot club, Mr. World has already advanced to become a demigod. Ma'am Hermit won't take much longer. This will definitely be a club filled with demigods." Emlyn chortled without arguing with Ernst like he usually would. He took on an attitude that whatever Ernst said was beneath him. Of course, he also understood that the advantage the Sanguine had after the Scarlet Scholar stage no longer existed. Becoming an Earl was in no way easier than an artificial vampire advancing to Shaman King. The digestion of the Scarlet Scholar potion is still relatively simple. All one needs to do is sincerely like the moon, worship the moon, and study the moon. This is what most Sanguine do usually. However, the corresponding ritual is in the hands of the demigods. Without their approval, even if I were to obtain a Shaman King Beyonder characteristic from the sun, I won't be able to become an Earl. Emlyn might be arrogant, but he knew very clearly what was required of him subsequently. There were two core powers of Scarlet Scholar. First, it was to create an environment that was advantageous to them. When the enemy wasn't good at spirituality or things related to the spirit world, they could create the effects of the full moon. On the contrary, they would also make the moon vanish if necessary. Second, it was to gain an instantaneous blink and a spectral form state under a certain area of the moon's illumination. Even if they were smashed to bits by an enemy, they could still reform themselves under the moonlight. And the strength of these powers was derived from one's comprehension and research of the moon domain as Scarlet Scholars. As for the strengthening of darkness-related spells, the enhancements of potion effects, and the resistance towards nightmare-like influences, they were just supplementary. Ernst was enraged by Emlyn's attitude. Just as he was about to speak again, he saw the mountain-like half-giant Utravsky walk out from behind the cathedral. He hurriedly bent his back and bowed his head as he continued cleaning the altar. Emlyn White also picked up his cloth and the candle stand, wiping its surface with great proficiency. In the silent atmosphere, he thought of something. If he were to leave the Harvest Church now, would the upper echelons of the Sanguine force him to hand over the mystical items and supernatural props he obtained from Ernst? I really have no reason to reject their request, because some of the items don't belong to Ernst in the first place. Emlyn thought about it seriously and decided to return to the room later. He would set up a ritual and sacrifice the spoils of war he received to Mr. Fool. When the time came, he could split it with the other members like the Star and Justice. Oath of Rose cannot be sacrificed. It's only one part of the pair. Whoever obtains it will be discovered and identified by the wielder of the other ring. I'll just treat it as a spoil of war. I'll hand it over to Marquis Nibs tonight. I should be able to exchange it for some rewards. As for the rest, I won't participate in the splitting. Emlyn very quickly came up with a plan. As for whether the Sanguine upper echelons would bear a grudge over this, he wasn't too worried. This was because he would also mention in passing about the cooperation that the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction had requested while handing over the Oath of Rose. This matter had happened last week. He had planned on informing the Sanguine upper echelon, but in the few mini-gatherings, the Hanged Man had advised him to do so after the punishment operation. It would accentuate his importance and mitigate any anger or resentment. Striking with a stick and offering a carrot. At that moment in time, Emlyn suddenly had a deeper understanding of the suggestion. 160 Bachland Street, inside Dwayne Dante's bedroom. The spoils of war received are pretty good. A diamond brooch that can raise one's energy and maintain lucidity while resisting spells that act on the body of heart and mind. A paper figurine that can prevent any fatal damage and psychic piercing. A belt that can produce sun and lightning damage. A wallet that contains more than 300 pounds. After receiving the sacrifice and returning to the real world, Klein silently sighed as he sat in front of his study desk. He then took out a transparent maggot. Upon seeing this maggot, he felt his head ache, recalling the pain of having his soul-body fracture. This was a worm of spirit that he had fractured from himself. It was to be made into the payment given to Snake of Fate Will Ossiptin. He already had an idea on how to replicate the item which could briefly allow someone to restore their strength. It was to use the worm of spirit as a vessel and copy the complete symbol from before to garner a response from the mysterious space above the gray fog. For this, the outcome of his divination was that it would be rather successful. That item's true essence is actually one of the powers of the Seer Pathway Sequence 3, Scholar of Yore, to borrow a portion of one's power from one's past self. Responding with the Fool's identity would definitely work. The only problem is that the corresponding dimensionality, mystery, complexity, and danger of the symbols cannot be directly engraved on different metal plates. According to Will Ossiptin, I have to use cogitation and draw on my spirituality to draw it on the worm of spirit. If it succeeds, I'll make myself one. I'll look at myself from the past and see if it will be Klein Moretti's childhood or myself hanging in the cocoon above the door of light. If it's the latter, it's best if I can confirm how long I've been hanging. Klein entered a cogitation state while in thought. Then he kept constructing symbols with his mind, allowing his spirituality to repeat this process outside as it penetrated the worm of spirit. This was a complicated and difficult task. If he wasn't careful, it might lead to failure. As the invisible symbols fell and augmented the worm of spirit, Klein suddenly trembled. The worm of spirit ignited by itself and turned to ashes. Looking at his empty palm, Klein felt a headache. After a long period of silence, he silently muttered, "Life sure is difficult." 1010 consultant fee. After rubbing his forehead, Klein was just about to split another worm of spirit when he suddenly saw Rionette in her dark, complicated-looking dress walk out of the void and stand beside the desk. In the mouth of one of Miss Messenger's heads was a neatly folded letter. "Who's it from?" Klein asked in passing. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, "The Mushroom King's Superior Mushroom King." Klein was stunned for a full 2 seconds before realizing that it could be Frank Lee, and Frank Lee's superior was Admiral of Stars, Catlia. "The Mushroom King is Frank Lee?" Klein asked in confirmation as he reached out to take the letter. With the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads' hair being held, they were made to bob up and down as though they were nodding. Miss Messenger even gives others nicknames. That's not right. Frank doesn't just specialize in mushrooms. His domains include cows, malt, fish, rose bishops. It's because Frank has had a breakthrough in his mushroom experiments, so Miss Messenger saw a boat full of mushrooms. Klein couldn't help but draw a breath as he hurriedly unfolded the letter. He was worried that the letter was Ma'am Hermit's plea for help. Of course, he wasn't too anxious because, at the most critical juncture, an experienced pirate like Admiral of Stars would definitely choose to pray to Mr. Fool. This letter did come from the future's captain, Catlia. On it were neatly written words. "The Queen has already confirmed the time and place. Wednesday, 11 p.m. same place. I've no idea what you said to Frank Lee, but I can tell that he has been very excited recently. He has done many experiments with the artisan. He said that he would be able to produce another phase of results in 3 to 6 months' time. He also made it clear that if he were to obtain the Druid potion, he could save on making many intermediary objects and directly produce the final outcome. All I can say is that "I wish you the best. I hope that everything will come to an end before the artisan completely breaks down. He has already begun regretting his faith in the primordial moon. Should I be happy that the securing of the City of Silver's food supply has progressed, or should I be worried about accidents?" Klein rubbed his temples and decided to put the matter aside. After all, Ma'am Hermit, who was almost about to become a demigod, was watching Frank. If some unexpected development really happened, she would definitely seek help. Phew. Having finally confirmed his meeting with Queen Mystic, he heaved a sigh of relief and flicked his wrist, burning the letter in scarlet-red flames. After watching Miss Messenger leave, he continued splitting a worm of spirit when he suddenly frowned. He felt that the desk and the letter's ashes in the trash can were abnormally off-putting. Subconsciously, Klein got some tissue and wiped the desk before covering the trash can. After doing all of this, he looked at his dirtied hands and stood up. He headed for the washroom and turned on the tap. As he washed his hands, he caught sight of the toilet beside him through the corner of his eye. He frowned bit by bit again. Today's cleaning wasn't done well enough. Klein softly muttered and suddenly sensed something wrong with him. Amidst his thoughts, his spiritual intuition quickly explained why he was feeling this way. This was a side effect of using Death Knell, as he had already become a demigod, allowing him to have a qualitative change in his spirit body and attain godhood. The corresponding negative effects had been reduced by more than 90%. The terrifying weakness of germophobia ended up becoming a trait of cleanliness OCD. Likewise, the period of weakness dropped from 6 hours to 1 hour, and the thirst that Death Knell gave him was no longer as obvious. Thankfully, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he skillfully pulled out the toilet brush from the side. 11 in the evening, above the gray fog, due to Emlyn White's request, all the members who had involved themselves in the punishment Operation Justice, the Star, Judgment, the Magician, and the Hanged Man appeared inside the ancient, magnificent palace. These are all the spoils of war. Emlyn threw 3,000 pounds that he had just sacrificed in the middle of the table and explained. One of the mystical items was Oath of Rose. It's a paired ring, allowing the wearers to be able to share their senses and thoughts with one another within a normal-sized city regardless of the distance. It's very valuable, but only one of the rings was acquired. It would spell danger for anyone who takes it. Therefore, I handed it over to the sanguine upper echelons and received 3,000 pounds in return. He originally thought of keeping the 3,000 pounds as his spoils of war, but he decided that it was better to sacrifice it and make it be one of the options. After a pause, Emlyn introduced the other items, listing their uses and negative side effects. He had even added more to the description. Knowledge stemmed from his penchant for sanguine history, and some shared by Ernst Boyar under Father Otravsky's watch. He is doing it with the intent of flaunting. Otherwise, with Mr. Moon's character, he wouldn't say so much. Oh, the reason for him being relaxed is due to Mr. Fool's absence. Audrey watched as a bystander without saying which item she wanted. Alger glanced at the spoils of war and said to Emlyn, "Have you met the sanguine upper echelons? Has the hunting of the key members of the Rose School of Thought been confirmed?" "Pretty much. I've also established contact with a member from the Temperance faction. However, he wishes to carry out the operation after September." Emlyn didn't hide the truth, believing that Mr. Hanged Man could provide useful pointers. Indeed, Alger nodded and asked, "It has to be after September. This means that they are waiting for something that will drastically change the situation." Klein, who was waiting for the mini-gathering to end somewhere else in the ancient palace, suspected that it had something to do with Miss Sharon's advancement when he heard that. According to Miss Sharon, she should have been able to attempt the demigod ritual in July. Don't tell me that this ritual will last at least a month. If that's the case, it's quite different from the other pathways. Klein had a theory he wasn't too sure about. Possibly. Emlyn thought for a while before agreeing with Mr. Hanged Man's words. Following that, he surveyed the area and said with a smile, "You can begin choosing." Audrey had Mr. World's promised Fate's siphon charm, and Leonard had obtained the corresponding rewards from Old Man Palles. They appeared rather calm with the spoils of war offered by the sanguine Viscount. None of them rushed to speak as they politely waited for the others to go first. In addition, they had either experienced an angel-level battle in person or witnessed the horror brought about by Ammon's avatars. Furthermore, they had confirmed that the Tarot Club contained potent forces, and they were suffering from some level of mental fatigue. Zia looked to her right before looking forward. Seeing everyone being so modest, she broke the silence. "I was involved in a very simple part of this and didn't take much of a risk. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has already paid £60 in advance. I'll just take the cash in the wallet." As she spoke, she took the handcrafted wallet, took out the cash and counted it. £335. Emlyn surveyed the area and nodded when no one objected. "Okay." As for the handcrafted wallet, Zio threw it in the middle of the table and returned it to Mr. Moon to handle it himself. With Zio taking the lead, for said, "I only lent out Laymanos Travels and didn't take on any risks. I'll take that moon paper figurine." Compared to the mystical items, such expendable Beyonder items were relatively lower in value. However, to the magician herself, she wouldn't have selected a mystical item even if she was qualified. This was because she could hire the corresponding member to record it if she needed a particular power of the mystical item. As for Moon Paper Figurine, an expendable item that could take a fatal blow and psychic piercing once, it couldn't be recorded. It was definitely the first choice for someone who feared for her life. After saying that, she waited for a moment. Only when no one objected did she take the Moon Paper Figurine. Emlyn then cast his gaze at Miss Justice. Leonard extended his hand and said with a smile, "Ladies first." Audrey didn't decline the offer as she swept her gaze across the items on the table. She pointed at the diamond brooch and said with a smile, "I'll take this." She had heard Mr. Moon mention that its name was Alcohol Nemesis. It kept the wearer brimming with energy with lucidity in their thoughts, giving them resistance to influences on the body of heart and mind. Thankfully, I had first used bribe charm to be safe, and with Ern still being in a half-conscious state after waking up from the dream, I wouldn't have been able to hypnotize him. This item is also useful to me. At the very least, it will give me another layer of protection when facing the higher-level members of the psychology alchemists. I don't have to worry about the negative effects if I don't always wear it. Audrey thought thankfully as she retracted her gaze from the diamond brooch in satisfaction. After the selection, Emlyn didn't give Leonard the chance to speak as he directly said, "This moon sash is yours." From his point of view, the moon sash was worth more than £5,000, something more valuable than the £3,000 in cash. Actually, I was leaning towards taking the £3,000. I have to buy the Word of the Sea, and the price is still £10,000 after Klein gave a discount. After spending that, I'll only have £650 in savings. Leonard ultimately didn't reject it as he nodded. "Okay." Emlyn finished distributing the spoils of war and picked up the remaining £3,000 in cash. He then split a stack and pushed it to the side. "Mr. Hanged Man, this is your payment, £1,000. You should call it the consultation fee." Without Mr. Fool present, Forbes was also a lot more relaxed. Alger didn't stand on ceremony as he nodded, reaching out to take the stack of cash. "The compensation for the carriage driver will also be borne by me." Emlyn surveyed the area in a rather good mood. 11 p.m. on Wednesday at the south entrance of the Backland Bridge. A figure quickly phased into existence in the night sky, with one hand on his hat and the other hand by his buttons. He had black hair, brown eyes and sharp facial features. This strongest adventurer with the cold expression was none other than Jam and Sparrow.